Okay, let's start by introducing myself. I'm Barry Hiern. I'm part of our APAC mobile and chatbot team. We look at basically trying to educate our customers, partners, etc., how they can successfully implement a chatbot strategy and the sorts of things they need to do to build that. Now, if you'd seen Martin's session just before lunch, that was looking at some of the design constraints. What we're going to look at today is some of the structures that Oracle uses to build bots, and then how we can use Apache's Freemarker language, template language, to actually extend that. Now, I said some of this will be sort of, for those who haven't used the product or seen the product, might be just basically sort of more than an initial thing. So I'd recommend going to the hands-on session that's at 4 o'clock if there's some things that you don't necessarily want to play with what you see here. But let's start by looking at when we decide to try and build a chatbot, the function of a chatbot is really to represent a human-like conversation. In other words, if I'm going to expose my back-end systems, I want it to be as human-like as possible. And the problem is, when we look at these conversational interfaces, they've actually gone through a generational change. And that if the first conversational interface you've probably all come across is something like an IVR, where you sit there and go, would you like option 2 to do this? If you want to do this, use option 3. So you sit there and go, 2. If you want to do this, press option 2. 2. So it was basically just not acting as a conversation, it was listening for specific sounds. And if we look at things like Siri and Alexa and things like that, they've the next big step, which is to be able to understand what you're saying, but it doesn't really understand a conversation. It understands a specific question. So, for example, if you went to Alexa, what's the temperature in Singapore? It would be able to answer that question for you. But if I turned around and said, Alexa, is it going to rain? It won't understand it. And when we look at a conversation when we're talking to a real person, we can think of a conversation almost as a game. We pass a ball around. So when I'm speaking, I hold the ball. And when it's your turn, I pass the ball to you. So what that means is ultimately each person is taking in some information and building up a knowledge base. It's building up a conversation, and that we're actually not forgetting what you just said. We're also processing it and then determining, where do I go from here? So human conversations are, in many ways, take input, think about it, and then work out what the next part of the conversation is. It's not predetermined. We don't talk or think completely linearly. We tend to think in non-linear manners. We go off topic, we come back again. So regardless of the conversation, we need to be able to have that flexibility. Now, when we look at sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide, that's why it's not showing up here. When we look at this, as I said, we can think of it as passing control of the conversation from one person to the next, and it's basically back and forth. But when we look at one of these things, each one of these steps really has some characteristics. And the characteristics there are really the initial prompt, what did you say to me? What was my response? And I don't instantly forget what you just said. So in this case, I'm basically remembering the previous pass of the ball, and I'm using that information to respond accordingly. So ultimately, that's now driving the conversation to the next question. But it's not hard-coded. I don't always go to question B just because I did question A. And one of the problems we have with designing a bot is we tend to think of it as a fixed conversation flow. And that if I answer question A, go to question B. If I ask question B, go to question C. And in many cases, that is true. But if I suddenly go off topic or I ask a question you didn't know about, it's a much harder thing to control. So what we want to do when we build one of these is look at our conversation flow and effectively try and turn it back into that concept of the ball. In other words, the bit of information that I'm going to pass around that makes sense as part of a conversation flow. Now, technically, what we're looking at here is the concept of a state. What's the state of the conversation? What things have been talked about? What's been memorized? All those sorts of things. Where do we go from here? So when we design a conversation, we design it with the idea of non-linear nature, and also the fact that if you've already answered a question, don't ask it. To give you an idea, if I went to my bank and I said, DBS, what's my balance? Then I would expect the bank to come back and say, which account are you talking about? But if I said, hey, DBS, how much have I got in my savings account? It looks pretty stupid if it came back and said, which account are you talking about? Because you've already answered that question inherently in the first topic, or the first. So what we want to be able to do is design effectively our conversation flow rather than being a fixed linear list, really as, if you like, a collection of these balls of conversation that are loosely coupled based on how we answer the question. So in Oracle's space, the way we represent a conversation is in what's referred to as bot ML, or bot markup language. And what bot markup language allows us to do is basically represent each one of those balls in a little piece of code called YAML. And YAML, which depending on how old you are, either stands for yet another markup language or YAML ain't a markup language. But basically, it's a human-readable language that allows you to represent that ball and the properties that go with it. So, for example, if we look at, sorry, there was a laser pointer here somewhere. So here, if you can see that, never mind. So we can see here that each one of those statements is effectively the question or the response. So what's my balance is my question to the bank. Which account you would like is the response from the bank. So what we're able to do there is basically break it up. And if I've already asked which account I'm interested in, the bot should automatically jump over which account. And because it's not hardwired A to B to C, it's like passing this ball around. And it's like, oh, I don't need to pass that one. I'll pass it over here to the next question. So what is this bot ML? Well, basically, what we're looking at is a series of these components that really do the hard work for us. And there are really two types. One lot that we design ourselves as a developer, and that's what we use to actually talk to the back end. Now, one of the points you should make with a bot, and we get asked this question all the time, does your bot answer this question? And the truthful answer is no. Bots don't answer questions, they find out what the question is. It's the back-end system of record that actually answers the question. So the idea of a bot is to really build up enough information to go and get the answer. And the way we go and get the answer is one of those custom components. Now, the other types of components we're going to be talking about here are the system components. These are predefined balls that have particular behavior. I ask a question, I print something out, I do a carousel of images. All of these are predefined widgets that you can drop into your conversation flow. And as I said, there are a number of them, whether they be user interface based, whether they be for controlling flow. I've already answered that question. Let's go here instead. Or things like translation. Normally, say for example, I've built my bot in English, but someone comes along in Bahasa. My bot should be able to recognize that it's Bahasa, do the conversion, process that, and then respond in Bahasa, or Thai, or Mandarin, etc. So each one of these predefined little balls allows us to effectively build up a non-linear conversation that isn't hardwired. So if I need to change the flow, it's how I answer the question. So before we get into more detail, what we'll do is just briefly give an architecture of what happens when you build a bot. So ultimately, there is a client. And the client is much in the same way as you had a browser. These days, we don't build web applications for IE or Mozilla or Chrome. You just build it for the browser. Well, the same thing goes for the bots. The chat client is effectively a universal client. It shouldn't be, I write a chat for Facebook, or I write a chat for WeChat, or I write a chat for Kik. I just want a chat, and whatever tool someone's using, whether it be a chat tool or a Siri or Alexa, it should just work. And what we're going to have is the ability to take whatever someone's asked, process that through AI and natural language processing, and then basically find out what they actually asked. What was the question they posed? Was there enough information in that question to actually go and find the answer? If there's not, then ask a qualifying question. Ask another one. Build up the information so you have enough information to actually go and get it. And the way we go and get it is we call one of these custom components that actually goes and calls my CRM, it calls my HR system, it calls my ERP, gets the appropriate information, and then sends it back to the dialogue so it comes back in as a bubble in my conversation flow. So let's get to Freemarker. It's in the title of the session, so it must be important. So what is Freemarker? Basically, Freemarker is what's referred to as a templating language. Think of it as a way of taking information and formatting it or doing manipulation on it independently of the back-end application. So rather than having to code extra functions, I can use Freemarker to basically format, do calculations, etc., embedded inside my application, embedded inside my ball. So think of it as a way of being able to take the standard sort of state, the standard ball that we're passing around, and plugging in extra functionality such that I don't have to go and write custom code. I don't have to write Java code. I don't have to write JavaScript code. I'm extending the ball and adding new functions to it. So Freemarker basically allows us to define a template that says, this is how I would like to present my information. This is how I want to format the information. And I'm going to take it from the back-end data model, and then I'm going to merge the two together, and that becomes my response in my conversation. So if we use the ball analogy, it's like saying, okay, here's a soccer ball. Let's take some Australians. It's now a rugby ball. And we'll show it as a rugby ball. So the nice thing about Freemarker is it's very easy to implement, and it has a lot of functionality that you can basically use to extend the conversation. And the way we do that is simply by adding it to the output strings that we're interested in. So for example, here we have a variable that we want to publish. So which bank account are you talking about? Okay, so the variable is bank account, and what we're doing here is saying, let's add a format mask to it. So you're effectively, the built-in expression is processing anything that comes back from the bot, post-processing it. Now, I can actually daisy chain that and do lots of different functions on top of the data that's coming back. So rather than having to write a program at the back end that says, this is my bank account, this is the format for the bank, it's only available on these days of the week, all that sort of thing, I can just call it, and then at the front end, add additional features to simply do that conversion, if you like, at the last step of the process rather than at the beginning of the process. Now, there are lots and lots of different functions available, whether it be strings, numbers, etc. This allows us to basically do a lot of post-processing before it gets reflected in the chat conversation. It's like the last step before the end user gets to see it. Now, I'll just quickly show a few. So here, for example, we have one of our components that's simply doing a printf. It's printing out hello world. But as you can see here, we have my text variable, and for example, I want to replace the word world that's coming back from the back end and replace it with friends. So rather than having to write a little JavaScript program to do that, I simply say $replace, and it'll automatically swap out the right word, world, with friends. Now, the important one here is what happens if there is no value. Say, for example, I said, DBS, what's my bank account? Now, I'm not a customer. I am a customer of DBS, but say I wasn't a customer of DBS, then it's going to come back with null. And I don't really want the conversation to simply come back with, your account number is What I want it to do is automatically replace it with something more friendly if there isn't a value for it. So you can see here on the first one, where it's got textvar.value, by putting the exclamation mark, I can say, if there is no value here, replace it with whatever comes afterwards. So rather than having to write a statement at the back end in my banking system that says, if not available, do this, you're simply at the very last minute saying, he doesn't have a bank account, replace it with, sorry, you're not a customer, or something like that. But where it actually does get interesting is, how do you guarantee as an end user how people respond to a question? So if I came along and said, how would you like to order what would you like to order? Now, you would assume most people type, but we all make mistakes on phones. So if I came along and said, I want a pizza, then unfortunately, if we just took a simple if statement, it's not going to know what to do with it. It's like, I don't have any pizzas. I've only got a pizza. So this is where actually using this final conversion allows us to simplify our business logic. because it effectively allows us to say, rather than expect the user to type the way we want them to, and that's a classic thing you see with things like Siri. Let's throw that. Who's got an iPhone? Okay. Who's got an Amazon device like an Echo Dot or anything like that? There's a couple there. Android assistants? Google Assistant? Yep. Have you found yourself phrasing your question in a way you think it's going to understand the answer? It's like, inevitably when you're going, it's like, hey Siri, can you do this and this and this with all this extra information, and you phrase things the way you expect it to. But in a conversation, we want to be able to have the bot understand things more effectively. So what we want to be able to do is take their input and massage it to the way we understand, rather than have them have to speak the way they think we're going to understand. So if we do a simple change here, for example, by adding a free marker, let's just force everything to uppercase, then in this case, regardless of how I say pizza or spell it with uppercase and lowercase, it's going to understand what I'm talking about. It's obviously a really simplistic case, but the idea is I should be able to manipulate what's coming in and make it fit with what I'm doing, not making the user fit with what I'm doing. Now, as I said, in this case, it's picked up that I want a pizza, and we straight away go to the next question. What sort of size would you like? Now, there are lots and lots of these functions that we can use. Now, in this length of presentation, we're not going to be able to go into in any great detail, but as you can see, there's lots of string ones. We have numeric ones if I'm trying to do range checking, and I'll show you an example of a range check, for example. So a number of built-in functions, including such things as dates. Now, for the first, just to give you an example here, what this particular statement is doing here is checking, did I mention a date in my original question? So if, for example, I would like to order a pizza on the 1st of June, that's an obvious date. Or can I order pizza next Thursday? That inherently refers to a date. So the question is there a date somewhere in what I asked? And if there is, let's use that, convert it to an appropriate format, and use that as part of the communication or part of the query. Now, the nice thing with Freemarker is if I didn't give it a date, let's try and default to one. And the way we can do that is simply using some extensions or Freemarker variables which allow us to do things like now. So now just gives us the current system date and time. So my conversation says, okay, can I order a pizza? Would you like it now? Yes, please. In which case, we already know that I want it at this time on this date, as opposed to, can I order a pizza next Thursday? Now, one of the big things that I mentioned, when we go and get the data, we're calling a custom component and we're calling the back-end system. We're calling our system of record. Now, that could be our CRM, it could be our HR system, it could be our ERP. But if the data doesn't change, do you really want to go through the hassle every time of having to call back to the system just to effectively get the same data? Well, this is where, again, Freemarker can help us out. And what we can do is effectively use an array inside the conversation flow. So that allows me to effectively cache information inside the conversation, and anytime I need that information, it's already there. I've already answered the question because it's available in the conversation. I don't have to keep on going back to my ERP to get it. So ultimately, what that allows us to do is set up a conversation flow that has both static data, and a good example of static data is like a menu. Menus don't change very much. Or I'll show you an example of what can I ask my bot? What options do you give me? That's information that is not changing, so there's no point going back to the database and getting it every time. We might as well cache it in the conversation. But the same with things like if I'm a food and beverage, I'm not going to update my menu every 30 seconds. So I might as well download the menu into the conversation, and anytime someone comes along and says, "Can I have a coffee?" Certainly. What sort of coffee would you like? And here's the menu. So you're cutting down on processing because you don't have to continually go back to the back end. So array structures are within the conversation flow. Think of it as actually loading that ball with data. So when I come to ask a question, the data's already in the ball. I already know it's there. So we can come up with any number of arrays, and I can do queries on it. So you can treat it like a mini database inside that conversation flow. I can go and get the value of a field. I can get the value of a record. So can I have a coffee? Yes. Black coffee, large, etc. All of that menu data is already in the ball for ordering a coffee. Now again, there's a large number of functions that we can use to add to making our conversation flow easier. And there's a couple here which are particularly interesting if you're trying to build a data set inside the conversation flow. So first of all, things like, I've got an array there. What's the index for Barry's record? So in this case, the value would be Barry. And automatically it will go and find which record has Barry in, and then give me the rest of the information that goes with it. So to answer the more complex questions, I don't need to continually go back to the database. I've got the entire record there. Likewise, counter and index. Now, the difference here is for those who are used to doing sort of lists and arrays, the index is a 0-rated index array. 0 record, first record, etc. The counter is which record is returned. So my first one, my second one, my third one. So effectively, if I'm doing a query, my counter is going to give me my row set, if you like, whereas my index is going to give me my position in the array. Now, we can take that even further by introducing the concept of a directive. And think of a directive as a tag that allows you control the flow and the content within that ball. So we talked about the array being the data set that you're passing around. The directive allows me to do like if then else, or if the value is this, print this instead. So it allows us to do procedural logic inside the ball. So rather than having to build a back-end program, you're effectively, once again, building it inside that ball that I'm passing around. It becomes more knowledgeable. It's not hardwired to the next question. The knowledge it needed is inside that ball. So we can have simple if statements. If, obviously if then else. Things like switches. If the value of Barry's bank account is ABC, then print out you're not a customer, or you are a customer, or whatever. Likewise, if I have a set of records that I might want to have in a field, so account A, account B, account C, I can print that out in one bubble by applying a list, and it just loops through and prints them out accordingly. So you can build this sort of more complex structure. So just to give you, oops, helps if I hit the right one. So just an example here. So we can see, okay, I'm We have a simple thing that says, hello, choose yes or no. So if we print out the text here, if we follow along that highlighted line, we take the value of the button, we put it into lowercase, we match it against the word yes in lowercase, and if that's true, then we print out you said yes. If it's not true, then we obviously print out you said no. So effectively what we have there is a Boolean if statement by looking at the text and simply applying these functions to return Boolean true or false. Okay, so let's have a look at this in real life. So if we can flip over to my desktop, and I'm going to have to change my glasses here, so suddenly I can't see you all. Okay, so here we are inside the bot builder, and you can see straight away that what I have is I've defined effectively a menu of questions that I might ask. Now, when you're building a conversation, when you're building a bot, the worst thing you can do is basically just leave a blank text field almost. Like, you have to guide the user. What can I do? What does your bot offer me? So one of the best things you can do is actually give them, here are some options that you might want to do with this bot. And once people learn it, they'll just start asking the questions directly. But in this case, I've got a simple array, and if I was to run the bot here, so let's come back and say, what can I ask? So that's doing the natural language processing, and then all things being right with the world. Hopefully our network haven't. Let me just do a reset. We seem to be having a network issue. Anyway, while it's working that out, let's come down here. We're again having a network issue talking back to the server. But what you might see here is in the first case, we have a simple switch statement. And what that says is, if this is the first set of questions I've asked for, print out, hello Barry, here's some questions. But then I go, what's the next set of questions? Well, there's no point saying, hello Barry, here's some questions. We might want to change the prompts. So in this case, we're using a simple directive to basically change the nature of what gets printed out. Likewise, if we look at the next one, we can see that there is an if statement that says, if I'm on the first page of 4 questions, then basically show a button that says more questions. If there are no more questions, like we have a menu of say 15 items and I'm suddenly up to 12, then there's no point saying no more questions because I've already said, well, there's nothing after 16 anyway. So I want to be able to turn that button off. So here we're using the directive to dynamically turn the button on and off based on the nature of the code. Now, likewise, if I was to show that as an array, let's give it one more go here. may have timed out here. So let me just try one thing. Sitting up here while it was doing the presentation, I think it timed out, so we'll give that one more time. There we go. Yeah, the session had just timed out. So you can see here that it's presented a prompt at the top and a series of questions that I can prompt the end user to say, well, I could type this question in, but here's some questions you might want to start with, or here's some menu items of things you might be able to do. And if I simply hit the More button, you can see that it's changed the prompt. So it used that directive to basically dynamically change the text that was exposed on the ball that is the menu. And if I keep on going more questions, at some point, you can see that in this case, it's actually said, well, I haven't got any more questions, do you want to start again? So the same thing happened. It was able to basically use that Freemarker to say, is this less than 12 or 16? Yes, it is. Let's dynamically change what we're exposing in our menu ball to change the interface. And obviously, if I select one, in this case, it's just going to hopefully tell me that I chose question 1. But let's do something else. Let's say, can you tell me if a number is greater than 100. So again, it's going to parse that statement, work out what I'm trying to ask, and you can see the first thing it's done is, well, okay, give me a number. So let's say 60. And obviously what it's done there is it's taken the number and within the ball said, well, actually, I already know 60 is less than 100 because it was processed inside the ball. I didn't have to call back to a program to say, can you just do this simple calculation? It's already done inside the ball itself. So you're building more intelligence into it. And from an array perspective, as I said, if we actually show what that would look like, you can see here, it's a very simple case of look at the number. That might be a bit hard to see there, sorry. Let's make that a bit bigger so it's readable. So take the number, check that it's less than 100, and then correspondingly say yes or no, how you're going to print it out. I didn't have to call another program. I didn't have to write a procedure. It's just part of the text itself. Now, I mentioned that we might want to do things with arrays. So let's try who is the DJs again, or who are the DJs, I should say. Now, this is one we actually wrote. If you come over to the developer lounge, we actually were developing a bot for Heineken to use at their sporting events. And their sporting events are both sporting and, much like the F1, you have the concerts afterwards and things like that. So they wanted a bot to allow people to effectively ask questions about the event, to be an e-concierge. Where's the dance floor? Where is the bar? Where's the toilet? Is there any parking? All that sort of thing. And in this case, who were the DJs? Now, you don't necessarily want to send all the information, because remember, one of the things with a bot is you only have a limited space. You don't want to basically bombard the user with information. So you might want to break it up. So rather than having to build all of the information in one go, we can effectively build multiple master detail relationships inside the balls. So in this case, if I'm interested in this particular, say, Thomas here, I can then go and look at and get the information based on the base information within the ball. So being able to, remember, download the information from the server, cache it in the ball, and then if I ask that question, only release the appropriate information to the end user. Again, just taking this Freemarker and allowing us to basically extend the functionality of the ball that we're passing around in the conversation and making it more intelligent. Okay, so if we can just pop back to the slides. So as I said, Freemarker allows us to take this concept of a non-linear conversation and add procedural functionality to it, but rather than being, let's link A to B hardwired, what we're effectively doing is taking the intelligence and extending the ball. So the ball understands more, and that way, as we pass it between people, it has that functionality built in. Now, Freemarker is very, very powerful, and there's obviously not enough in this time to really go into it in a lot of detail. So if you're interested in it, I would recommend going to the Apache website, because there's a lot of documentation on all the various things you can use to extend the bot flow itself. Now, do sign up for the cloud test drive, or the cloud test trial, and use that, if you like, if you're interested in bots, to actually access Oracle's intelligent bot platform. And that way you can see building both the dialogue flow as well as the natural language processing. Now, we didn't go into any depth here at all about the NLP and how you would do that, but it's similar in terms of ease. You can build a bot and train a bot very, very quickly the way we've implemented NLP. And using this sort of pass the ball around model with the YAML, it also makes the dialogue flow much easier because we don't have to be a professional developer. We don't have to understand C# or JavaScript. What we're doing is really setting properties to this thing that we're passing around. Now, yes, it's in a YAML file, but it's ultimately just the properties of the question or the response. Now, as I said, in a bit over an hour's time, there will be the hands-on lab for the bots. If you are looking at implementing a bot, I highly recommend coming along to that and having a play with the product, actually getting a feel for what you can do and how easily you can do it. Okay, so at that point, I'd like to thank you very much for coming. Is there any questions? Sorry. Let me get my eyes back again. Yep. Okay, so it's because Freemarker is actually technology agnostic when it comes down to it. Freemarker originally was designed, the question for those sides in the room was, how would you implement Freemarker in something like Google Dialog, the dialog flow editor? And it's a similar model in terms of Freemarker, when it was originally designed, was a tag language for HTML pages. But in terms of designing a template, the base template code is Java code behind the scenes. But once you've done that in the various platforms, then Freemarker effectively becomes an extension to the componentry. So Google would have to allow or expose Freemarker inside their particular dialog flow or the components. But as I said, it's an open standard, so you can actually build that into it if it's not already there. But the concept is, as a template engine, you're extending the component that goes with it. So in our case, we've already built Freemarker support into our components. So, but as I said, it's a very popular framework. So you can generally, if you're in the print section, just try and put a Freemarker sort of, they're called impositions. Basically the curly brackets, that's how you represent a value in Freemarker. So name of the variable, curly brackets, and if it prints it out, it supports Freemarker. Okay, any other, another question, sorry.
Curious, how does the bot support kind of subjective questions like what's the best value pizza you have on offer, or what's the best pizza deals that you have, and stuff like that?
Yeah, the question is, how does it handle subjective questions? And to be honest, coming back to my point, the bots don't answer questions. They find out what the question is. So if I said, what's your best value, then what you would have is the bot would determine that you're after a pizza order and that you are after a promotion based on the intent. Now, it would then call your CRM, your recommendation engine or whatever, that would return what the current promotion item was, and that gets presented in the bot. So it's not the bot itself that's doing the recommendation, it's working out what you're asking. I'm ordering a pizza, I want a discounted one or whatever, and then I would call the back-end system to get the appropriate response. Okay, I think my time is up. So again, thank you very much for your time.